Good evening. My name is Jennifer, and I'm a librarian at the Burbank Public Library. Welcome to tonight's program, part of the 2020 Burbank Reads series. Tonight's offering is a conversation about the hate you give, featuring Dr. Tiera Tangsley and Dr. Safiya Noble. Burbank Reads is a program inspired by the idea that the shared act of reading can bring the community together. Everyone in the community is encouraged to read the same book and participate in discussions and learning surrounding the subject matter. Our main title is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. We have print and ebook copies available through our library website, burbanklibrary.org, and we hope you'll check it out and join in a book discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules so that we can all enjoy this online program. You should see our speakers on the screen. As audience members, you'll not be able to speak, but you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the program, you're welcome to type questions, and we'll take them at the end if we have time. When you leave the program, you'll be redirected to an evaluation form, and we would really appreciate it if you could fill that out to help us improve our programs in the future. We'd like to thank the Friends of the Burbank Public Library for their sponsorship of this program. And tonight's program is a conversation about the hate you give by Angie Thomas. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Noble and Dr. Tanksley. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks to everyone watching and to the leadership of the City of Burbank and the library. We really appreciate the opportunity to be invited and to talk about a book that has garnered so much attention and still remains quite vital in terms of some of the underlying themes of the book. I'm really thrilled, Dr. Tanksley, to get to be in a conversation with you. You know that you are one of my most favorite scholars in America, and your research on African American young women and social media is so important. So I just wonder, before we get started, if we could take our time and talk a little bit about maybe why we're here as part of this conversation, maybe sharing a little bit about our work and our backgrounds, just so that those who are watching would have an opportunity to be oriented properly around our expertise in studying a variety of different kinds of texts and media that are relevant to the Black community. So why don't I kick it to you and give you a chance to talk about your work, and then I'm happy to talk a little bit about mine after that, and then maybe we can turn to the text and of course the film and maybe even more importantly, the many kinds of issues that are associated with this book.
Thank you, Dr. Noble. You're my favorite scholar as well. So hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Tiera Tangsley. I'm currently an assistant professor at CU Boulder in their Department of Education. And my research is really looking at the experiences of Black girls who witness Black death and dying online. So girls who are seeing videos like Philando Castile or in the book Khalil, and what some of those socio-emotional consequences are for them, as well as educational ramifications. So that's kind of the broad overview of, I guess, my research. So I come to this book bringing not only my personal experience as a Black woman who witnesses these types of traumatizing events online, but also somebody who researches it and has really spoken to a lot of girls across the US to really show what our community is experiencing online when these types of tragic events happen.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I love your work because, for those of you who are watching, I am an associate professor at UCLA, and I co-direct the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. And one of the things that we are also, deeply studying is social media, digital media platforms, from Google to Facebook to lesser known household kind of name brand technologies like that. YouTube and others, but really kind of thinking about the way in which Black life in particular is represented in a variety of different kinds of visual media and other kinds of media. And I should say that I am also appointed in the Department of Information Studies and African American Studies at UCLA. And for those of you who aren't sure what information studies is, many of you will certainly know what an old school library and information science department is. And so Professor Tanksley and I, in fact, met at UCLA. She was in the Department of Education working on her PhD, and I was in the Department of Information Study in kind of the same school, professional school at UCLA. And we were both very interested in the ways in which, again, African Americans are portrayed and related to, because I think both of us, one of the things, Tiara, you know, I think about our work is that we're both so deeply interested in the different kinds of imaginaries that are created about Black life and about race and race relations in the United States. And many of those imaginaries, in particular, in kind of the realm of the digital, are often kind of racist imaginaries, right? And sexist imaginaries that have a long, deep-rooted history in America. And those ideas about race and people of color and African Americans, many of them are kind of profoundly misrepresentative. And those misrepresentative ideas, as we know, are often the kind that really powerfully circulate, not just on the internet, but prior to the internet, through Hollywood, prior to Hollywood, through literature, right? So there's kind of this long history of how writers talk about race and talk about communities and talk about Blackness and race relations. And I think The Hate U Give in particular is one of those texts that means different things to different people. And it's a kind of in some ways, like a polarizing text, if I can just kind of jump off into it, where I think, like other kinds of texts, you know, and text to film, I think about the film like The Help, right? And how America had kind of two different readings of The Hate U Give or a film like The Help, where in many ways, I think kind of mainstream white America, or let's say non-Black America, picks up a text like The Hate U Give and feels like they're able to kind of enter a world that is not otherwise available to them, right? And that they are kind of able to trace the contours of how they imagine Black life. And of course, I think, you know, one of the things that was so interesting about this book is that many Black Americans read this text and had a very different take on the way in which those contours were kind of understood and maybe even misunderstood in some cases. I think many people also felt it was misrepresentative. So I'm just curious about, you know, when we come across texts that are, and images and ideas. This one was so profound because it was turned to a film. So if you don't mind, I want to ask you like some of your thoughts, but of course you can ask me back what, you know, I'm not going to just interview you. You can also push back on me and with your questions or ideas. But I'm just curious, what do you think are the most, you know, besides the kind of different readings that people have of a text like this, what do you think are the most important issues that should be pulled out and that we should spend time with in this brief evening that we have tonight about The Hate U Give? What is it? What kind of jumps out for you that's really important?
So as I mentioned before, you know, we actually jumped on the official call, was that this was my second time. I just reread the book. And my second reading was very different than my first reading. So the first reading, I think I really focused on the social media conversations about Khalil's murder, and like the discussions throughout the book of Black Lives Matter, protests versus riots, things like that. And Starr was kind of this, narrator. She was just the narrator kind of going through it. And I was frustrated with Starr for not speaking up. The common things I think a lot of the readers or the viewers are seeing. The second time I read it, what spoke so profoundly to me was Starr's PTSD. She is literally in the car with Khalil when he's murdered by Officer 115 or 15, I can't remember the number. And throughout the book, although she never explicitly talks about this PTSD or names it as that, we see that whenever she encounters a police officer, whether it's when the cops are pulling over, I think they're doing like a check or something, like a checkpoint, and there's another incident towards the end of the book when her father is in an argument with Mr. Lewis and the cop shows up there too. Every time she talks about almost throwing up, right? Bile gathered in my throat, I couldn't breathe, I was sweating. And that is a really important issue because so often Black girls' pain goes unnoticed, right? And they carry so much racialized trauma because of these systems of oppression along lines of race, class, gender, et cetera, but also, right, experiencing police brutality, not only themselves, but witnessing it for loved ones and other people in their community who die at the hands of law enforcement. And so I think what was so important for me was that I hadn't noticed another Black girl in pain, right? That it was almost so normalized to me. And so it brings me back to my research about Black girls who witnessed police killings, whether it's online or in person, or who survive police brutality, right? And the complex PTSD that they continue to experience because of that. So yeah, that's one thing I think that really spoke to me the second time around.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I mean, there were while we're on Starr and kind of the things she said and didn't say, I mean, I was reminded of, for example, the way that Starr is in this kind of interracial relationship with a young man who she's kind of always in these internal conversations about, like, when there's an opening to talk about racism or her own lived experience or the experience of her family or her neighborhood, that she stuffs it down or avoids it or just wants to leave it alone. And because it's actually, it was so resonant for me, where I thought, how many times in my own life, just in one day or in 1 week, it's like, it's too much effort to try to unpack to either my white colleagues or neighbors or friends the nuance of particular kinds of pain that are that people have the luxury of not really understanding, and that it actually cannot be communicated fully at an intellectual level. It is part of the lived experience. And I think you're right, the PTSD, it's like it's part of it is linked to different kinds of trauma bonds that oppressed people experience, right? That it's kind of like an insider type of knowledge that in many ways defies words. It's like, it's just, it's incalculable. I can't translate for you. And often leaves then me incredibly unsatisfied with how somehow Chris, I think, comes to like, just like ride along, like, I'm just gonna like ride it out in this relationship. And what that does to the possibilities for intimacy and real friendship and real relatedness, right? When women, and Black women, in this case, Black girls, cannot put the people they love inside the interior of the kind of intimacy of the violence that they experience in their lives, and that always becomes like a barrier that cannot be crossed. So I don't know, that was something that really I was reminded of this time as I was kind of refreshing myself to the text in preparation for tonight.
Yeah, and I mean, even the friendships that she has outside of that relationship, you know, at her school, I think it's Haley and Maya.
Right.
The fact that she isn't able to explain, not only explain her racialized pain, but even show, like even express, like even feel it. Like she doesn't allow herself that piece of humanity that's so important for healing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it talks, I think for me, what really kind of comes through is like the fragmenting and the fracturing that happens to Black girls' souls, right? The spirit murder that we're constantly enduring, not only because of this physical violence, this physical death and dying, but also, you know, being in spaces, in worlds that don't see our full humanity, that we aren't able to fully take up space in, because if we do, there will be some type of backlash, right? For Starr, it's I think it's Haley who, you know, kind of blames her for being too Black, or like when she's talking on Tumblr, I think it is, about Black issues, about Emmett Till, right? There's a hostile pushback. And so I think that the murder, right, and the dying, Black dying, is happening on so many levels. It's not only the physical level, it's the spiritual level that you're talking about, right? That like it's with her friends, or these people who she calls friends, her partner. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
huge.
I love that. Yeah, I think you're so right. I mean, this kind of I know that people are interested in this book. I think people who are not Black, non-Black people who watch the film or read the book, um, you know, in some ways there's kind of like this veneration of this notion of being able to like code switch, right? That Black people who can kind of live inside of two worlds or multiple worlds. Like this is you know, I'm older than you, so significantly, I know. So you know, I'm very Gen X, and come from, you know, like coming of age in the 80s when, um, for, you know, Black people of my generation, we were the first to go to fully integrated schools where our parents, when they were going to elementary school, they probably went to segregated schools. My parents definitely did. We did not go to integrated schools. Integration happened later in their lives, kind of, you know, in their kind of high school aged lives, and they did not go to integrated schools. That was still very controversial where I grew up in Fresno, California. They didn't actually integrate and start busing in Fresno until I think 1982. So that tells you a lot about where I grew up in terms of the racial and kind of social and economic segregation and resistance to integration. So here you know, my generation was really the first to grow up under fully integrated schools and with busing. And one of the things that I feel like was such a, you know, an idealized so-called benefit was that, you know, people of my generation would be kind of the first to really traverse multiple worlds, right? All these kinds of imaginaries, you know, as if Black people have not been in all kinds of worlds since, you know, our arrival on these shores, right? So, I mean, there's never been, I mean, the intimacies again of the Black experience and the racialized experience in, you know, kind of starting, you know, with kind of both being free originally in the colonies, because a lot of people don't realize that many African people came to the Americas as indentured servants, were freed, were released. People came also free. You know, they think it just like that the whole transatlantic slave trade really like popped off in the 1700s, but it took some time for that to be cultivated and crafted here in the Americas. And so it's interesting, like this idea that one evolves such that they can code switch, right, or move between worlds, or this idea that to go to a wealthy private white high school somehow gives you access or gives you something more because what you have and where you come from isn't enough. And I think this is one of the dimensions of this book when I talked kind of early on about how we read this text differently. I think there are many, certainly I can say in my own life, again, from my own generational experience, this was an idealized version of America for Black Americans, which is that you could go to white schools or predominantly white schools or predominantly white colleges and universities, that you could speak the King's English, that you could flow in a white world, in white corporate America, right? These kinds of academia now where I work. But when you're at home, you could keep it real, right? Some version of this. And I find this so fascinating because in this book, there's the way in which that experience gets framed is as if Starr's community that she's from, her family, her neighborhood, is always kind of framed, and through Starr's own words, but also in kind of, again, the uptake of this book, as being pathological, at a deficit, the problem, right? And that the opportunity is always around escaping the truth of like her own community and her culture, which is so rich and so vibrant. And like, I'm at the party, when the book opens up, I'm like, I've been at that party, I mean, it's like so many times and it's so fun. And like, oh, like that great, for us, when I was a kid, it was like the Coolie party. That was the big, like 4th of July party that everybody wanted to go to. And so I just wonder what you thought about like this dimension of how, again, I think some people read that movement between worlds, again, as like that Starr somehow gets to escape something bad, and that this idealized kind of white, affluent, middle class. I mean, this is such a very LA kind of characterization too. This book could have happened in LA, and the way that people kind of talk about what it's like to live above the 10 or below the 10, right? Or to be from, the Valley, right, versus LA or South LA, or to be from the West Side, versus the East Side. And so I just wonder what kind of your take is on that. Am I reading that? Is that all me just reading it this way?
No, I mean, I think I resonate with that. I think that, so I was, growing up, I went to schools that were predominantly white, and I lived in communities that were often predominantly Black. And I think what was projected upon me by the people at my school was that I was getting something special, and that I was entering a new world that I had never been a part of, when in reality, in order to survive in America, I've always had to know about that world, right? Like I've always had to be able to enter spaces that are non-Black, and function in ways that don't end up with me dying or being insulted or being feared or being silenced, right? There's all of these different violences, whether it's rhetorical or material. And that, so in reading the book, it's like I did understand, or like I had a shared experience in going to a school that didn't necessarily represent my community. However, I think the part that was missing was how hard it was to be in that space. And that code switching it can be very violent, right? And I remember I have this memory of being in kindergarten, and we were doing grammar lessons, and I used to say ain't, like this ain't it. And my teacher was really upset, and she was like, that is broken English, and if you keep talking like that, I'm gonna send you out. I went to a very strict like religious school. And so I believe I was put on timeout, and my grandmother at the time, she was babysitting me while my parents worked. And my grandmother, she grew up in rural Augusta, Georgia. She grew up as a sharecropper. She attended segregated schools in Georgia. She remembers Martin Luther King speaking, like all kinds of things. I have stories for days about the Deep South and what that was like in the 40s. So I come home, my grandmother speaks fluent, beautiful Black English. And she says something to me, and she uses the word ain't. And I was like, you can't use that word because that's a broken word. Ain't is not a word because it's not in the dictionary. And I've never experienced so much fear in my life from her response. And that was a really important moment we had about code switching, where it was like, our language is not broken. Our language is perfect, and it is forged from so many different languages. You know, our indigenous languages, multiple indigenous languages, also, you know, standardized white English, and that, you know, this language comes from this deep-rooted history of diaspora and resistance, right? That the fact that this language is an amalgamation of all of our cultures and is timeless, right? That it keeps updating and adjusting and resisting silence, and keeps manifesting at the top of like the lexicon, right? Like everything, Fleek, like that became viral. Everything becomes viral, right?
Right.
Because our language is so demonstrative of the power of Black culture, right? And so thinking about in that conversation, she was telling me that there's something broken, right? And you'll go to those schools and you will learn, you know, the academic English, but you will never ever stop speaking African American English, because some things cannot be explained. Going back to what you were saying earlier, there are some stories that just cannot be told in languages that are non-Black. And so I'm thinking of the TED Talk, where the woman talks about being trilingual and that she speaks in multiple tongues, one of them being African American English. And so I think about that when I think about Starr, because I don't see that complexity in her struggle, you know. But
Yeah.
like you said, reading into it, that's what I'm taking from it.
Yeah, I really, really love this, because I think this is why when there's like a breakout book that, you know, let's say crosses over and gets like really taken up broadly in a mainstream to mainstream audiences, again, kind of non-Black audiences, all that you're talking about falls away. And it's just not, there's no way to access the depth and the dimension of what you're talking about in terms of the way in which these complexities are flattened. So for me, what happens in the book is that this notion that Starr is like in her own internal struggle, even around code switching. My husband and I, we both have these t-shirts that say, "Too tired to code switch." I should have wore it tonight. I don't know what I was thinking. And sometimes we wear it. I remember I was so frustrated once at work that I wore it. I think I wore it to a faculty meeting. You know, I think only one person in the room knew what it meant, so it was fine. I didn't get in trouble. But you know, it's like, yeah, I don't have the strength today, and so you know, it's like, and this is of course what it's like for, you know, most Black women in academia, quite frankly, is a struggle. Like, I don't have the strength to have to go into these spaces and not be understood. And I really feel like this was another dimension that really fell short for me about the book, is that it just didn't, it kind of valorized the idea of speaking proper English, so to speak. And of course, we know that there's been such a struggle in the real world, let's say not in a fiction book, for Black girls who are smart, who have a lot going for them, to have their intelligence weaponized and framed as acting white. So that actually, that being smart or being gifted or having certain kinds of like pathways, I think in, you know, the way you talked about your own childhood, right? That even our own intelligence gets ascribed to, you know, other people and situations, and schools and people outside of ourselves, right? That's actually who gets the credit. That this phrase, even acting white, you know, is part of that way of invalidating the genius of Black girls. And so I really love what you're saying, because it just makes me think of, you know, that dimension. And I can only imagine in the research that you do, all the kinds of ways of knowing that the young Black women that you study have, that doesn't get validated and recognized and heard and known. And in some ways, Starr, I feel like, represents like the girl who doesn't get, for whom like the truth of who she is. And in fact, you know, what's so tragic to me is Khalil is the person who sees that in her, and he's dead in like 5 pages into the book. So it's like, what, you know, so that really, that upsets me too. I don't know. I just need to say it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. I have a lot to say about Khalil's death. Oh my gosh.
I don't have the strength for this. You know what I'm saying?
I don't even know where to start. Let me get the tissues. Okay, so
I need some water now.
So, okay, one of the things that I think was so we've already talked about how Starr has a hard time. She has a hard time articulating racialized pain, right, and racialized trauma. Because of the fears of being misunderstood, of not being heard, of not being seen, or of being too seen, right, by the police.
Right.
So Black girls are often toggled between this visceral invisibility, as we've been talking about with her partner and her friends, right, not seeing her true self, and this also violent hypervisibility, where, you know, she is overseen by police, and that could, you know, obviously have a lot of ramifications. That's also what happens to her dad and Mr. Lewis, and I mean, it happens to Khalil, right? The hypervisibility of Blackness. So at the same time that she's not able to articulate Black pain, I also find it heart-wrenching that she's not able to articulate Black life and love until deep into the book, right? That Khalil, she loves Khalil and her other friend, whose name I'm drawing a blank, but her childhood friend, there's 3 of them.
Is it Natasha?
Yes, Natasha. That she has this profound love for these 2, you know, friends who Khalil, it was her first love, and Natasha, her best friend, and both of them are lost to violence, systemic violence, right? We could differentiate and say, well, Khalil died because of police brutality, and that's where the racism is, and Natasha died because of gang violence, and that's just the deficit community that they live in. When in fact we know that so often the intra-communal violence is a symptom of the greater systems of power, right? That leave
100%.
people constricted and with unprocessed PTSD, all kinds of things, right? That the book actually does touch on when they talk about Devontae, right? And like why he ends up being in a gang and why he ends up stealing. It's because he's trying to protect his family. He feels caught, you know, all the complexities, right? But just circling back, like, what does it mean to be so fragmented that you can't even experience or talk about that Black love, you know?
Yeah, I know. This is the part where I have to say, you know, when the film came out, and listen, there was a lot of, like watching a film like this in my house with my husband is like, it's like Mystery Science Theater, where it's like a commentary over like every single thing. You can't even, it's like, what, I don't even, what just happened? Because you're talking the whole time, because a thing happens and then he's like, ugh. So, you know, that was happening as I was refreshing and listening to the audiobook. At one point I was like, babe, you can't be in here while I'm listening to this because you're talking too much over the book. And part of that is because I think that, we both were reminded that this was marketed, this book and this film were marketed as like a Black Lives Matter movie. You might remember this. There was so much money that was kind of poured into supporting and marketing this book, and a lot of celebrities came out. And when it came out, the co-founders of Black Lives Matter wrote a very, very pointed, crisp analysis of the film and why it was not a Black Lives Matter movie. So there's certain dimensions, like there's a state-sanctioned shooting, right? A police officer kills an African-American child. He's not convicted. I mean, this is ripped out of the headlines of this summer, right? This could be Breonna Taylor. This could be Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. It could be so many different, Trayvon Martin, so many people that we've lost. And just too many to name right here. And here we have kind of like the contours, like the anchors of a story that might make it seem like it's a Black Lives Matter movie, right? Or book, where, the police are exonerated, right, or not indicted, and then the community sets its, Black people set their own community on fire, right? This is the kind of narrative. And this is actually the narrative that plays out. I mean, it's played out all summer long. I'm sure this has to be one of the reasons why this book was selected by the Burbank Library, because probably I'm imagining that some of the librarians thought that it was kind of like a book for the times, and yet there is this really powerful, I think correct analysis that this is not a Black Lives Matter book. And I wonder what you think about that and what you think the reasons are. I don't know if you saw this piece that Melina Abdullah and Patrice Cullors wrote about the film, but I'm just curious what, do you think it's a Black Lives Matter movie or film or, book?
Okay, so no, I don't think it's a Black Lives Matter book. I think it's a book that, like you said, talks about, threads in some very important issues. But, there's a lot of aspects about, Black freedom dreaming and Black resistance and what the revolution or what liberation or equity, healing, all of these things look like that weren't necessarily in that book. And I think those things come part and parcel with Black Lives Matter. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a complicated question.
I know. I put you on the spot too. I'm so unfair, but I'm that kind of friend.
Yeah.
I'm going to put into the chat for all of the attendees a link that you can just kind of copy and paste and just save for after, for later, if you want to take a look at it, because I think they did such a better job than I can do right here in this conversation tonight. But I will say that some of the contours of the conversation in this piece are really about, again, some of the ways in which exactly what you just said a few minutes ago, which is that the kind of structural oppression that Black people live under and have lived under for, for centuries, never really gets attended to. And that at the end of this book, the community is kind of like blamed for potentially harming itself, right, ourselves. And there's kind of a falling away of a true analysis of like structural racism, right, or denials of racial justice in terms of the courts and accountability for Khalil's death. And I think this is one of the really interesting conversations that, quite frankly, I don't think still has been articulated fairly even in recent months, so that we have right now, we're kind of hurling toward a presidential election, and that, people are already voting. We're kind of underway in an election season, and there's still so much lack of understanding all these years later since this book came out about why people protest, why people respond to crises in ways that are profound, that are material, that are agonizing. And so some of the challenge here for me with this book, again, is in the way in which, the community's pain gets turned around against them, and I think this is something that we still see in the way that the struggle for Black lives gets kind of perverted and really deeply, profoundly misunderstood. It's very difficult. So maybe this piece will be of interest to people who are attending the session tonight with us.
Yeah, I mean, so, okay. I'm glad you brought up the protest part, because I think it was talked a lot about as a riot. And, the tone is very much, we need to bunker down and hide because we don't know what's going to happen, get close to the floor in case there's gunshots. And then kind of after the chaos, I think is what they actually call it, after the chaos, they kind of go back to the suburbs. And eventually, when the story ends, we have the resolution, which is Starr's family moves out of the neighborhood, the Black community. And what comes to mind is all of the conversations this summer, right? Following the tragic and brutal murder of George Floyd, and then, Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain, like all of these people back to back, right? And we had the protests, and mainstream media was very much like, these are riots, and, Black people are destroying their own communities. And I think there's a really important conversation there that I was hoping to see in the book, but that, you and I have in real life, about the value of Black life versus the value of property, and talking about how, protests are often framed as these are violent, right? We have conversations of this is going to be a non-violent protest, because embedded in that is the belief that destruction of property is violent, right? And that's somehow equated to the violence of losing a Black life. And those are obviously not the same thing, but we did see in the Breonna Taylor case, right, that was kind of the takeaway, that like the findings, right, what they were charged for was endangering the property and not her body, right? So like, I think that part of the book was so, triggering, really, because I was hoping to actually see like a rich discussion of the complexities of why we protest, right? Because if Black life isn't valued, but you value property, then maybe the only way to get your attention is to, get out in the streets and maybe, start a little ruckus at the stores. But I mean, that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, one of America's favorite abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, said power concedes nothing without demand. And there's like another part, but no one ever says it, so I can't remember. And I think that there's something, it's like in our family where everybody's just got like a half a Bible quote, you know what I mean? Just the part that's convenient.
Yes.
But fine. So, I think it's like, this is kind of part of the logic of, even Dr. King talked about, riots being kind of like the voice of the voiceless. And so, again, I'm paraphrasing. I probably didn't get that exactly spot on, but just flow with it. So, I think we have this book, it's interesting. I'm really looking forward. I hope that those of you who are in this conversation with us as an audience will, turn your mics on and have a conversation with us, because my guess is that you and I are having a conversation that some of the people who are watching are like, I didn't take any of that away from this book. Do you know what I mean? It's like that again. And I just want to offer that there are many readings. This is one of the reasons why, I did my master's in library and information science and my PhD in library and information science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I love books and I love knowledge institutions. And I think one of the things that's so powerful about books in particular, but I also love films, is that they give us a place to kind of have a conversation around what it means to be human, and also what it means to dehumanize in many of these processes too. And so I think that this is maybe a good opportunity for us to kind of open up the event here tonight to others, and help us understand, other readings of this. I know there has to be readings that are obviously, this is a controversial book in terms of the way in which different communities engaged it. And I think that what's really valuable, I always invite my students to think about this at UCLA, is that we don't actually have to all walk away with the same interpretation, but it is important for us to have something in common to talk around and learn from each other around. And so I think this book is definitely like a hot book to engage around, because I think, as we've tried to demonstrate from kind of just our brief engagement here together, I know, Tiara, I could talk to you all night long, that there are complex readings of this. And I think it's also want to invite people to also think about, as you turn on your mics and share or drop in your thoughts into the chat, that you don't have to agree with us, and you don't have to have seen what we saw. And I think this is, again, a place, when I was talking with the organizers, we were talking before the event started, and one of our colleagues was sharing that these are difficult conversations to have, right? And to get in on, and we don't have a lot of good vocabularies yet. And this is one of the reasons why we have so many challenges in understanding and being understood, is because we haven't really practiced a lot. And so I just want to invite us to practice, get our chops in having these conversations by just kind of maybe posing questions or thoughts of your own. And I'm going to turn my mic off for a minute.
That was an amazing discussion. And you're right. It was absolutely, you had totally different takes on it than what I had. But I was so glad to hear a different point of view, because that's what this whole thing is about. Do you think that you could speak a little bit more about institutionalized racism? Because I think that that's a term that some people are hearing for the first time, and some people may never have heard before. And unfortunately, our country was built on it and continues to profit from it. And I think a lot of people really will be surprised at the extensive history of it. Could you speak to that a little bit more? Thank you.
I know when you're looking at me like that, like, you got that? You got that? Okay, so my husband just handed me the Frederick Douglass quote. He is so on point, you guys. You don't even know. I'm super lucky, and this is a serious quote, so I'm going to hold it for the end. All right. So I think when we're talking about institutional racism, let me just start us with kind of what our common sense understanding of racism in America is today. I think the common way in which people think about racism is they think about it in terms of like not liking a person, being mean to a person, being unkind because of the color of their skin. This is kind of the very, very basic way that children, I know I have a child and I understand the way in which teachers, for example, talk about racism. Like, don't be mean and talk about a person based on things that they cannot change, like the color of their skin. You know, I think that most of us who study systems of race and racism really actually would articulate that race is an invention. It's not your how much melanin you have or don't have. You know, like in my family, my son likes to mess with me and tell me that you know, I'm gray, right? Because I'm not as brown as he is, and I try to explain to him that I'm light black, and that's actually I'm black and I'm light black, and so we got all these things. So these ideas about like our biology is not actually what race is. And discriminating against each other based on our biological features, again, of not being white, is also not really what race and racism are. Most of us who study this agree that race is it's a social practice that has been enacted in the United States and exported around the world that is about a system of power. And the way we enact power is through racism, which is to say, racism is a hierarchical power structure. Race are the categories within that power structure. So white is considered a race as kind of the, in a country like the United States, where let's say that might be the most privileged group of people, historically speaking, and maybe even contemporarily, although we have to complicate that with class for sure, because we know that there are indeed many, many poor white Americans who are profoundly discriminated against for many different kinds of reasons, or who are also experiencing very terrible quality of life, right? So we know that poor people, and we have to complicate these categories. But when we're talking about institutional racism, we're talking about these categories that get made that are in a hierarchical structure, and that hierarchical structure is how racism works, privileging some who you know, are kind of in the majority kind of most mainstream American identity, and all the rest of us who are hyphenated Americans kind of fall, let's say, below that in the hierarchical structure. Some people even call us subgroups, which is interesting. So you have racism that works by the making of racial categories, and institutional racism, and much of that is played out interpersonally, there's no doubt. When we talk about institutional racism, though, we're talking about the laws that enable that kind of privileging of a racial hierarchy. So those are discriminatory laws that you know, separate but equal, laws that keep Black people from being able to vote. It also includes practices. So right now, for example, we're in the like full swing of you know, kind of active voter suppression campaigns that are specifically targeted against African Americans. These are the same kinds of they're practiced differently, but they are the same kinds of tactics or strategies, well-coordinated institutional strategies that date back to Reconstruction. So, you know, I think when we're talking about that, we're talking about institutional kinds of discrimination, barring people from jobs, barring people from housing, barring people from opportunities. That's the way in which we think about institutional racism. It's what ideas in which groups get privileges and get power, and which are oppressed and denied opportunities and rights. And those practices play out in really every sector, from who gets admitted to college, who doesn't, and those often play out again in these ways that are, you know, kind of active acts of discrimination, but they're very hard to pinpoint because they aren't necessarily tied to one person who makes a decision. They usually get kind of bound up in cultural practices. It's just like, you know, like on the job, how you see institutional racism work is when it's time to look at all of the resumes and we see the Black sounding names that have the same exact job qualifications and experiences as white sounding names, and people somehow feel like the non-Black sounding names just might be a better fit, a better kind of fit with the culture of what's going on here. So this is kind of how it gets played out. Many times, again, not necessarily directly by individuals, although that's part of it, but it's also about kind of the way in which we preclude and include, and the very serious differential kinds of consequences that lays out for millions of people, quite frankly, in this country.
Yeah.
If I add anything, Tiara, what else?
Yes,
Please.
let me sprinkle some salt and pepper on that.
Love on it.
So yes, when I think about institutional racism, I'm thinking about systems of power, right? So Safiya, like you said, yes, people think about racism today as, you know, calling people racial slurs or saying, I don't like that person because of the color of their skin, right? Instead of thinking about the way that systems are actually that they are disproportionately harming certain groups, right? So I think about like the school to prison pipeline, right? Schools as an institution, thinking about even Starr, right? And the schools that are maybe in her neighborhood that are under-resourced, underfunded. We know from scholarship that schools that serve predominantly Black and brown students often have police in them, because there is an assumption that students of color are inherently violent or criminal, and they need to be searched. So we have schools in our neighborhoods that have metal detectors when you walk in, security officers throughout the campus, camera surveillance systems, you know, barbed wire, all of these things, and then schools like Starr's that, you know, have open free periods. So that's already, right, a system that's set in place because of these beliefs in who needs to be contained and who doesn't, right? And then from there, we have the school to prison pipeline. So students who are attending these schools that have an influx of police surveillance in communities that also have an influx of police surveillance, we see that they are often in contact with police more often, and then more likely to be incarcerated, right? Just from sheer amount of contact that you could have, right? If there's 50 police officers in one neighborhood, the chances of you doing something that's going to irritate one of them is very high, right? And so now we have a system that's not just one school, it's happening throughout the country, where our kids are being arrested and sent to prisons because of things like dropping cake on the ground. We had a young Black woman who was recently incarcerated because she didn't complete her digital homework during COVID, right? We have the young Black woman a couple of years ago who was body slammed by the police officer in school because she didn't put her phone away, right? All of this violence that then kind of not only funnels our Black students into institutions like prisons, but also for Black girls, it often pushes them into other situations like sexual violence, right? And you know, our work talks a lot about that, and how institutions like the internet and also the, you know, other industries, the porn industry. I couldn't remember if we had young kids involved in this call. But yeah, these industries that actually benefit from these ideas about criminal bodies and also disposable bodies, hypersexual bodies. So yeah, I think that racism is much more insidious and much more invisible. It's often not the explicitly stated, you know, I don't like this person because of their color. It's more of, like you said, all of the exclusion, all of the people who are supposed to be contained and corralled and controlled versus those who aren't, and how that actually biologically impacts your life expectancy, right? All of the studies that show when they control for all of the factors, money, education, that overwhelmingly, time and time again, race and racism are the things that will shorten your life expectancy. And that's not just because one person or a couple bad eggs don't like you, right? It's surviving a system that was not set up for you.
Yeah, that's so right. I mean, I just would invite people to like, UCLA has done some really interesting research about, for example, the public health crisis of COVID-19 and the ways in which institutional racism, quite frankly, has been a profound part of why Black and Latino Americans are dying disproportionately in the population because of things like, differential levels of healthcare, under-resourced delivery systems of healthcare. So we know, for example, if you have to use a clinic or a hospital that's in a low-income neighborhood or predominantly Black or Latino neighborhood, that hospital or medical facility is less likely to get the kinds of resources that, let's say, UCLA Medical in Westwood is going to get. So, these are the kinds of things that I think are really important when we talk about, health disparities, life expectancy. Certainly public health researchers at UCLA have had some very wonderful and profound statements about racism as a public health crisis, because it is not, again, entirely just about interpersonal aggression. It's really about the profoundly unfair distribution of resources in our society and in our community in Los Angeles.
That was incredibly well spoken. Thank you so much for all of your passion tonight. I appreciate it so much. If anybody has a question, please feel free to pop it into the question box, but I think that we're going to get ready to wrap it up. Wow, what you were saying about groups of people who need to be contained is something that I never ever thought about before, but it really makes sense and is something that I'm going to have to look into tomorrow. So thank you both so much for being here. Oh, we have a question. Hang on one second. Could you both speak to the issues surrounding teaching books like To Kill a Mockingbird and how they oftentimes traumatize Black or brown students? There's so much pushback to the suggestion of replacing books and supplementing with authors of color. How do we help people see the importance of so doing?
This is such an interesting question because neither one of us are like high school teachers. So this is kind of like a book that probably wouldn't get taught in the kinds of classes that we teach, but we understand the spirit of the question. And I'll say for myself that, sometimes I will teach what I think of as very traditional, mainstream Americana, right? That might be similar to something like, Mark Twain or To Kill a Mockingbird or something that is very, very much a part of the fabric of American education. And I will teach it alongside other kinds of banned books. And of course, this is really important in the context of doing this event with the Burbank Library, because we know that these kinds of like banned books or controversial books include voices of people of color. I'm always stunned that Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is always on the banned books list. It's like, how can that be? I mean, my mom gave me that book to read when I was like 13 years old or something. And, so I think it's interesting to teach those, if those books are kind of required in your school system as part of the, canon of American literature, then teach them critically. Teach students how to read critically a text like this. That is actually powerful. It's like, what do these texts say about the psyche of America, right? What do books like this say about the worlds in which they were written in? And how do we, teach students how to complicate these narratives and like speak back to them, right? Rather than just kind of leaving them out there with no scaffolding around them. It's like, how do you speak back to? And that is actually a very important skill for students of color too. Rather than treating them as if they are fragile and unable or incapable, I really try to say, like, well, what would you say back to this? How do you argue with a text? Those are actually really powerful skills that we need for survival in this world too. So I think that's a way to think about it. We do this also when I teach, visual culture and visual studies. I will give students, really horrible stereotypical kinds of films to watch, and then I teach them how to speak back to them critically. And then I ruin them. I ruin those movies, quite frankly. I mean, it's like, but I tell them I'm trying to make them the most interesting person at a cocktail party in the future, and they'll thank me one day.
And a better human being, I think, too.
For sure.
Dr. Tanksley, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to say something similar, right? That if this is something that you have to read, I think that what's most powerful is speaking back to the text and speaking very explicitly about the oppositional gaze, right? That Bell Hooks talks about, and talking back, that there is power in critiquing and offering daring to challenge the canon, right? Because I think when I was in like AP Lit, we were reading, I don't even know, I think we were reading something like To Kill a Mockingbird as like our warm-up book or something. And to challenge the text was seen as like, inappropriate. Like I was stepping out of my lane because this was an author and I was a child. And I think that stance teaches or tries to teach youth of color to not speak back to power, right? To accept the world as is being told to them, and that their life experience isn't actually true, right? That there's a true narrative, and if you feel or think differently, you're just wrong. So I think that you can have those discussions around the books, bringing in other types of literature, other stories, whether it's Kendrick Lamar lyrics, right? Complicating these narratives. Yeah.
Question everything. We have one final question to ask, and I just lost it. Somebody wanted to know if you could give an example of a book that you do believe represents Black Lives Matter. That should be easy, right? Just off the top of your head.
Well, I already have mine, so Tiara,
okay, go for it.
30 seconds to think of yours. I put into the answer, there's a new film by an LA-based filmmaker named Ogi Ibuono, and her film is called Invisible Portraits. And I saw this film early. It's about to be widely distributed, but you can get it right now on Vimeo. You can rent it or buy it, and I strongly encourage you to do that. I tweeted out, this was the Black Lives Matter movie of 2020, and it is so powerful, and it's actually exactly the kind of film that I would assign if I were to assign a book like this, right? Just to, like, as a way to, again, like, put tension and complicate Starr and help us unpack, more about like the things that Dr. Tanksley was talking about in terms of institutional racism as a shaping process that includes PTSD and includes kind of active suppression and oppression, and the way in which Black women and girls really come to shine and be resilient in the face of that over generations. It's a very beautiful film. Bring a giant box of tissues with you, but you will emerge. She calls this film a love letter to Black women and a re-education for everyone else. And I think you'll really enjoy it if you watch it.
I haven't read fiction in a long time. I mean, this was really, I haven't read for pleasure in a long time. what's coming to mind, I have a bunch of academic books, but what's coming to mind right now, as not necessarily the Black Lives Matter as we're thinking of it contemporarily, but really like the history. So I'm thinking of Lovecraft Country and how complex that show is around these issues, right? When we talk about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about a history, right? It's not just a momentary thing. This is something that has been deeply embedded into the American experience, the global experience, really. And I think Lovecraft Country does an amazingly complex way of talking about these issues, because so often I think the danger of talking about contemporary issues is historic amnesia, right? And not linking it back to the past. So, you know, I'm thinking of Sankofa, right? Go back and get it. That in order to talk about right now, we have to talk about back then. And Lovecraft Country does that by it talks about police brutality. It talks about all of the things we've talked about today, right? The PTSD, issues of intersectional identity, intersectional oppression, Black love, Black trauma. I mean,
yeah, it really does.
I mean, if that show needs to win all the awards, because my husband's constantly trying to get me to sit down and watch it. I watched one episode last week. I was so wrecked out. And I only did it because one of my good friends from undergrad was like, you know, a character actor in that episode. And so I was like, oh, I got to see my friend. And then I was like, he's like having nightmares watching this show, but it is so good. And it really is, I mean, gosh, Dr. Tanksley, I wish I could take a class where you were teaching this show, because I bet it would just be so, so good. We need to see you write something about that.
I would love to. That and Watchmen, both.
Oh, and the Watchmen, that's another big one in our house.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You've given us all so much to talk about and think about, and so many things that I need to go research tomorrow morning as soon as I get into the library. And I really cannot tell you enough how much you've broadened my mind just tonight. And I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you to all of you who participated, and especially for our wonderful speakers. We have a couple more events coming in our series. We have a book discussion about The Hate You Give Monday at 7 p.m. And we have Color Changes Everything, Racial Diversity in Animation next Thursday at 7. You can learn more and register at burbanklibrary.org. And when you leave this evening, you'll be redirected to an evaluation form. We would really appreciate it if you would fill this out. One question will ask you what ideas you have for the library, the city of Burbank, individuals or groups that we could take to improve racial equity. And we would love to hear your ideas. If not tonight, think about it tomorrow, sit on it for a while, and share it with us, because we don't obviously have all the answers. These ladies do, but it's going to take all of us working together, and we would love to get your input. So you can share that on the survey, or you can just go to burbanklibrary.org. And thank you again, everyone who watched, and our speakers. So have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.